بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم آمين وبعد. We continue with the al-Mustakhlas fi Tazkiyat al-Anfus by Sheikh Said Hawa rahimahullah, which is originally taken from Ihya Ulumuddin by Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullah alayh. And so we gave an introduction onto the subject about the subject matter the past two lessons last week in over 2 nights. And so tonight inshallah we're delving into the first chapter or part. He titles it Part 1, the proper etiquette between the seeker of knowledge and the teacher. And so we know that the subject of the book is purifying the soul, or sometimes translated as purifying the heart. The Arabic term is tazkiyatun nafs. This word nafs is a bit more comprehensive. We don't really have an exact translation for it in English. The nafs is sometimes translated as the soul, sometimes it's translated as the heart, sometimes it's translated as the self. I think the self is probably more accurate. And the nafs, it really encompasses our entire being. Sometimes it can refer to our soul, our heart, or our entire being, and so it's a very comprehensive word. And we talked about what are we purifying ourselves from. We're purifying ourselves from these negative traits, which we are by nature disposed to, right? We're inclined to by nature. We describe some of the things that the Quran mentions: hastiness, oppression. Our sense of justice is not naturally. Our sense of justice is not sound. We're very self-centered. And so establishing justice requires a lot of humility, a lot of discipline. We're ignorant, so naturally we're ignorant, and we're arrogant. Naturally we're hasty, impatient and impulsive. So we're trying to purify ourselves from all of these negative qualities. And on the opposite side, we're trying to adopt, it's not just we want to get rid of them, no, we want to adopt these more righteous qualities. So that is the journey of purifying the soul. We're trying to get rid of these negative traits and cultivate these righteous qualities through that we also have some inclination to, but it takes a lot of work to cultivate and develop. It isn't as intuitive or as impulsive as the negative qualities might be. And so the first thing the author starts with is knowledge. And knowledge is very interesting. With the New Year's, people have, New Year resolution, and they have goals and things of that sort. And I kind of find that interesting, because if you think about just the psychology of transformation, how do people transform themselves, right? Is it by setting, a number of goals and telling yourself, I'm going to work through these, towards these goals, and kind of like systemically structuring these goals? Transformation isn't really like that. Transformation is very organic, right? It happens very gradual, and it happens very slow. And so you kind of think about, it isn't like this idea of like, I want to accomplish this thing and I'm going to, just accomplish it. There's usually a lot of other things that go along with it. And so to attain that goal, that resolution, it takes kind of really a lifestyle, a mindset, an environment, a setting, right? Mentor, knowledge, all of these things. When you have these things in your life, then you start to really see transformation, right? It isn't just information. It isn't just a setting. It isn't just an intention. It's kind of a variety of things that are coexisting, and they kind of influence that transformation, and they create that transformation over a period of time. And one of the most important things in creating change in oneself or transforming our lives is knowledge. And it's mentorship. It's foundational. And our deen gives a lot of emphasis to this. If we look at the beginning of Revelation, with the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He had a mentor. If we're going to use contemporary language just to make it relatable, right? We use the term mentorship. He had a mentor. He had a teacher. And his teacher wasn't just providing him information. It wasn't just an intellectual relationship. It was a physical one, where Jibreel alayhi salam had held the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The relationship started physical before it even became intellectual. There was this physical connection between the Prophet ﷺ and Jibreel 3 times. And he embraced him physically, right? Intensely, 3 times. To show that the relationship between a mentor and a teacher isn't just an intellectual, or it isn't merely transactional. Because in the modern world, the relationship between students and teachers is very transactional. You know, there isn't really a qualitative feature unless you really have a great teacher that really cares about you and that really wants to cultivate that relationship. It's usually very transactional. I did my job, you do your job, you know, let's call it a day. But in our deen, we don't call that, you know, that isn't a model, that isn't an Islamic model. Rather, our deen emphasizes sanad, it emphasizes a chain of transmission, very important. To know that your teachers have been trained by people who've been trained by people who've been trained by companions, that chain of transmission. And so people have sanad. And this is something that our scholars preserve, this chain of transmission, until today. Until today. And I personally have had the blessing of studying under numerous scholars who can name their teachers. And I told them I want a copy of all of their isnad, 4 volumes, with every sheikh quoting who their teachers were. This lineage of knowledge, not a lineage of ancestry, this lineage of knowledge. Going back to my sheikh originally learned from Imam Bukhari, and he learned from so and so and so, all the way to Abu Hurairah or Abdullah bin Umar, and so on. And for every book they learned, they had a chain of transmission. And so our deen encourages us to learn and encourages us to also have this a sense of mentorship with our teachers, with our scholars. And it also encourages us to choose our teachers carefully, be very selective. As it says, like, inna hadha al-amr deen. Indeed, this matter is your deen. It's your life, it's your akhirah, it's your way of life. So look carefully at who you take your deen from. فَانْظُرُوا عَمَّنْ تَأْخُذُونَ دِينَكُمْ. Look carefully at who you take your deen from. One of the scholars, the very famous saying that they would mention is that you should take a scholar who is مَنْ يُرْضِيكَ حَالُهُ وَدَلَّكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ مَقَالُهُ. Your teacher should be someone whose state you are pleased with, meaning their character and their connection and relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that when you look at, you feel very comfortable with. You look up to them. And so, subhanAllah, teachers are, right, our Islamic scholars, right, when we're talking about. I've had scholars whose presence reminds you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Just their presence, they don't have to say much. You know that this man's heart is always with Allah, always in the remembrance of Allah, or a woman. That they're always in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We had a scholar, you could hear the Quran recitation in his home every night before Fajr. There would be rarely a night where the recitation of the Quran would not be heard in his home. This is not at Fajr. This is before Fajr, 2-3 hours before Fajr, tahajjud every night. And so you want to seek a teacher who is of this type of quality, somebody who's really like spiritual state you are pleased with, and whose وَيَدُلُّكَ عَلَى اللَّهِ مَقَالُهُ, and whose statements bring you to Allah. Right? This person isn't just simply intelligent. There's a lot of intelligent people out there, well-spoken, right? High achievers, very capable people. But their statements don't really bring sincerity about the heart. They're intellectually their speech, their talk, their ideas, very strong and very thought-provoking. But they don't soften the heart, and they don't draw you close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You just feel that it's just information that they're conveying, but there isn't this connection of heart to heart. And we've seen that, unfortunately, in a lot of the madrasas that children grow up in, and that the relationship between the student and the teacher is just very, it's intellectual, and oftentimes comes with a lot of harshness and emotional and physical abuse. And that isn't going to assist you in your journey to Allah. That oftentimes actually becomes an obstacle in your journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, seeking this path of knowledge, so I'm giving this introduction because this is what the author, rahimahullah, will be covering in this section that we'll be reading, inshallah. We'll be kind of reading it. I like to personally read, the book word for word. So I'll try to read everything we're covering, inshallah, and comment when appropriate. I would also love to hear your comments and your questions, inshallah ta'ala. Does anybody have any questions or just thoughts, comments, anything really, to benefit the rest of us? Anybody have any questions or thoughts they would like to share? Yes, brother.
Yeah, I was actually having a debate.
Yeah.
Evangelical Christian, and he was saying, well, they have the Bible, especially the New Testament or the Old Testament for that matter. Look, you have the Hadith. It's the chain of narration. We have a chain of narration, don't we? And the fundamental difference is we know who the links are in this chain of narration.
Of course.
Your narrations are anonymous.
Right.
It's like you just found it, you don't even know who wrote it.
Right.
Matthew, anonymous. John, anonymous. Book of Paul, anonymous. Well, it's supposedly from Paul, but the writers are anonymous.
Yeah. Right.
Whereas we've classified that, like things that are just reach us from anonymous sources, they're classified as like weak or straight up lies.
Right.
Versus ones that have complete chains and multiple chains.
Right.
We know the names of every link in that chain.
Yes.
Same cannot be said about anything in either the Old Testament or the New Testament.
Yes. Yeah. No, Jazakallah khair. And I think, so the brother, he was sharing that this chain of transmission that has been developed by our scholars and maintained, there's nothing like it. And when you look at other religions especially, if you compare it to Christianity or any other religion, there is a lack of verification. Knowledge was adopted based on trust, based on reputation, or just assumption. And the Quran documents this. إِن يَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ وَإِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. They're just following assumptions. And assumptions don't prove anything in relation to truth. You can't establish a fact using an assumption. And this is how the religions distorted the messages of the prophets. And so one of the beautiful things of Islam that our scholars did to maintain Islam is that they preserved this chain of transmission. And so he said that, there was a Christian scholar who said we kind of have a similar thing, but he's like, no, it's not even close, right? We don't know who these transmitters are. We just have first names, and that's just the author. The people after, who are they? And from this author to the disciples, who are the people? What is the chain of transmission? We don't have that knowledge, right? And if it wasn't for chain of transmission, Islam would have been distorted like any other religion before. Like, it took immense sacrifice by our scholars. They traveled the world, they learned the names of everyone, and they would look at their reputation. They would look at I remember when studying the science of hadith, if a narrator was known for falling asleep in class, his hadiths were weak. Even if he was credible. If there was this sense okay, maybe this person had a hard time paying attention or something of that sort, They would discredit the hadith. Not because he's lying, but because there's a possibility that this person's information is not credible, or he misheard, or he assumed. We can't rely on that. They looked at character. Imam Bukhari, very famous story. He saw a man who was trying to capture a horse, and he was acting like he had hay in his hand, and he lied to the animal. And Imam Bukhari said, he traveled a long distance to receive a hadith from this man. And he said, how can I trust a man who lies to an animal? Your character is flawed. I can't take, you're not worthy of transmitting the word of the Prophet ﷺ for me to write it and convey it to the ummah. Right? So like this level of detail and caution with the character, with the intellectual capability of the student, the narrator. They even looked at timelines, locations. This person claimed they heard from that person, but the timeline doesn't match, or their locations don't match. They said they met him in this year, but in that year the scholar was in this land and this person was in this location. They couldn't have met. There's some type of inconsistency there. They would say this is not reliable. There's a big debate. How about if a scholar says, a narrator says, anyways, there's much more that can be said, but this science of hadith is really like, it is what fortified Islam. And so this transmission of isnad, maintaining a chain of transmission, it didn't just only preserve like the relationship between teacher and student, it also preserved the credibility of the information that is being attributed to the Messenger ﷺ, and that is being attributed to companions, right? And so we definitely have that, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. I'll continue, inshallah. If we have more comments, we can take them at the end. So we'll start with the introduction and just kind of read through. If you have somebody, inshallah, try to share a book with somebody beside you. Introduction, the author, rahimahullah, he says, and may Allah benefit us with his knowledge. Allahumma ameen. Inherited prophethood, teaching knowledge, is the most likely factor in effectively reviving the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Reminding people of Allah's signs, guiding them to the straight path, and purifying their souls in accordance with the divine commandments are the most important missions of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He that inherits prophethood masters these three virtues and performs them in the most perfect manner. It is rare to find that these three elements, meaning reminding the people of Allah's signs, guiding them to the straight path, and purifying their souls in accordance with the divine commandments, mastered by just one individual. We may find a preacher lacking in knowledge, a scholar who is not a competent preacher, or we may find a scholarly preacher who is unable to purify the souls. He that possesses the three traits, the elixir of life, possesses the elixir of life. And if there is no such person, for the revival of Islam lays with those who desire it and are active in pursuing it, but who are themselves not fully qualified. This is the intro, inshallah. I'll comment on it. The most important target of preaching the word of Allah is to concentrate on reminding people of his signs in the creation of the universe and in the creation of their own selves. The preacher should focus on the divine governance of affairs, reminding people of his punishment and revenge, besides drawing to his promise to the obedient and his threat to the disobedient. The scholar should concentrate on teaching the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as well as the sunnah of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, which is meant to clarify the former. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَكِنْ كُونُوا رَبَّانِيِّينَ بِمَا كُنْتُمْ تُعَلِّمُونَ الْكِتَابَ وَبِمَا كُنْتُمْ تَدْرُسُونَ. But you Rabbaniyun, Rabbaniyun means learned men of religion, because you are teaching the book and you are studying it. So here he's saying that we should start with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that is the primary, and that the sunnah follows that because it is a clarification to the book of Allah. Educators should concentrate on reforming the people's hearts and perfecting their manners and behavior. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كما أرسلنا فيكم رسولا منكم يتلو عليكم آياتنا ويزكيكم ويعلمكم الكتاب والحكمة ويعلمكم ما لم تكونوا تعلمون. Similarly, we have sent among you a messenger of your own reciting to you our verses and purifying you and teaching you the book, the Quran and the hikmah, and teaching you that which you used not to know. There are moral diseases in every age, some being particular to a certain time and some being timeless. The truly pious scholar is the one able to treat both the contemporary vices, diseases, and the timeless ones, this being a token of his own success of self-purification. During the first generation of Muslims, the sects of the Murji'ites, the Shi'ites, the Kharijites, and the Mu'tazilites came to existence. The Murji'ites based their doctrine on abandonment of deeds. I'm not going to get into the sects. I would rather not dive into that. There's a lot of details to that. But I will, inshallah ta'ala, maybe just comment briefly on what he's sharing. A couple things that stand out is that a scholar should be one who brings together knowledge, character, and preaching. A scholar should be one who can do all three. He has knowledge, character, and can preach to the people. But you find that mastering all of these three qualities doesn't usually come together very often in one individual. Sometimes you find people who are great teachers who can convey information, and sometimes you have other teachers who are great mentors, and you have other teachers who are great inspirational speakers. And so the Muslim has to try to find a shaykh who's trying to find a scholar who kind of embodies all of these qualities, and the scholar should try to be someone who embodies all these qualities. They're intellectually developed, meaning they have studied, they have learned, they have read, and they are eloquent, and they're very careful with how they speak and how they convey the message of God, and they themselves are developing their character and their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to influence people by how they live. They are a living model for people. It isn't just they speak well, but their character and their lifestyle is a tool by which they're guiding people. And so this is how a true scholar should be. And when a person seeks a teacher, they really want to seek a teacher that has all three qualities. Now, you don't have, especially as Westerners, we don't have access to a large body of scholars, very limited. And even the imams and community Islamic leaders that we have in our communities oftentimes are considered beginning to intermediate level students. They're not, when comparing them to Islamic scholarship, they're not considered at this high level of Islamic scholarship. They themselves are considered beginning to intermediate students. And that is how I identify myself. I will never claim the title of being a scholar. Right? Because when you look at the traits of the scholars, and I look at myself, I'm like, I'm nowhere even close to that. Just objectively speaking. Right? Because if you see the discipline, the taqwa, praying tahajjud every night, having a wird of azkar morning and evening, reviewing Quran 2-3 juz daily, reading books hours on end, writing, preaching, teaching, reforming the community, like this is the level of scholarship. One who has read hundreds, if not thousands of books, and studied under hundreds, if not thousands of teachers. These are scholars. People who have shown a consistency in their ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for a long time, right? So we here in the West, we are very limited. We are very limited in the scholars we have access to. So we have to be selective, and we have to be also practical with what type of teachers we adopt. Who do I have access to? Even when you want to study Islamic knowledge, who do I have access to? Right? Do I have access to a Quran teacher? Okay, I'm going to take my Quran teacher. Do I have access to a fiqh teacher, hadith teacher? You find who you have access to and you take advantage. You have to be practical. The ideal is you would want somebody who really embodies all these three qualities, right? Someone who's really spiritually developed, they're a model, they're intellectually have a deep understanding of the deen, and they can preach, and their speech is very inspirational and very thought-provoking and reforming. But if you can't find that, then you find the next best thing. You find a specialist in this area and a specialist in that area, and you continue to seek knowledge from different scholars according to what they specialize in. So I want to make sure he's given us the ideal, but the ideal isn't always practical, right? So understanding what is practical for our situation and taking advantage of that. Brother Abdurrahman? Right. Right. And there are many other barriers, right? There are many other barriers, some of the administrative issues, life, just a variety of different barriers. And so we do the best we can. We do the best we can in seeking out a scholar. He's just given us the ideal here. Here he moves on to, on page 4. He shares a couple of hadith that I would like to read. And so inshallah ta'ala, we'll start at the top of page 4 and just kind of go through the hadith that he shares with us. And then we'll move on, inshallah ta'ala. He says at the top of page 4, such deviations are diseases of the age that never cease to plague the Muslim world. It is the duty of the knowledgeable scholar to cure these diseases, vices, wherever and whenever they occur, or vaccinate the community against them if they do not exist. This applies to every malady that continuously emerges. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "The bad habits of the previous nations had prevailed among you are envy and hatred." Right. So these are the traits of the nations before. These are timeless illnesses or vices, envy and hatred. And so he's saying the scholar should be one who realizes the condition of the community they serve. How many times have you gone to a khutbah and the khutbah is completely out of touch with what people are going through? That's what he's saying. He's like, you have to know what the community is going through, what is society going through, and address that. Right? That is what it means to be a properly trained Islamic scholar. If what you're talking about as a scholar is completely different than what people are going through, then you're very disconnected from the people's lives. And you're not going to be effective in your role as a scholar. You're actually going to become deterrent. Because people are going to go and they're like, what is this? What are we talking about? Right? They feel like this deen is so abstract and so disconnected from their life, it actually becomes discouraging, right? And so we have to be very, very wise. This is for scholars especially. He's talking about who the scholar should be. And us as followers, we have to be also wise, right? And like, what scholars are we listening to and who are we learning from? And so here he's given an example of a timeless disease that exists among nations, which is envy and hatred. And we know that, for example, in our world today, right, what are some of the issues we're dealing with in our community? We're dealing with lack of faith, lack of conviction. Believing Allah and His Messenger has just become tradition. And there's so much influence out there, and people aren't really confident in what they believe in. Or there's just a lot of unanswered questions. The scholar has to address these doubts. Materialism is another thing. Consumerism, an attachment to material. People, we are all comfortable, but everybody feels like, oh my God, what am I missing? Right? And we're always looking for the next high, the next fun thing, amusement. Right? One of the modern issues of our world is we're amusing ourselves to death, entertainment. We have to be mental health, loneliness, isolation, depression, disconnectedness. Right? Especially in Seattle. You feel so just alone and disconnected. And one of the brothers used, and I really resonated, like when you travel in some communities abroad, although some of the conveniences we enjoy here isn't there, you feel a lot more alive. Just a sense of living and energy and presence. And you're here, you're very comfortable, but there's this sense of numbness and emptiness and void. The scholar has to be aware, what is my community going through? What are the challenges? And then they have to be, when they convey the message of Islam, you're not just conveying the knowledge. The scholar has to convey this knowledge in a way that addresses the ailments, the vices that the society and that their community might be dealing with. I'll save the questions for later if you don't mind. Hold on to it though, inshallah. Hold on to it. I'll hold on to it. I want to go through the next hadith.
Now you talk about the question I want to bring up.
Oh, okay, I've already addressed it. Inshallah, share your comment. I would love to hear it. Inshallah ta'ala. Can we hold? I want this for the sake of time, and then inshallah we'll get to that. I want to share the next hadith. Or continue. He said, it is known that each epoch, if I'm saying it correctly, has its vices and immoralities. I think each era, right? Or the following are moral diseases of our own time prophesied in the text. So we have timeless diseases, and we have diseases that the Prophet ﷺ prophesied in the future, will happen to future generations. The Messenger of Allah ﷺ said, the first thing to be taken away from the earth is humility, khushu'. Right? Like this is the ummah. These are people who are believers. The first knowledge Allah will remove from the ummah will not be intellectual knowledge, it will be spiritual knowledge. It will be humility with Allah and concentration and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That will be the first thing that will be removed from the earth. And so the Prophet foretold this, and subhanAllah, the Prophet told other hadith, the masajid will be beautiful, the hearts will be ugly. Right? So for telling that, yeah, we'll be developed, maybe structure, on a structural level, material level, but on a internal level, spiritual, inner level, no, people will regress. There will be a great regression as time goes on. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, when he talks about the, just to kind of, comment on this part about future illnesses, when the Prophet ﷺ says the nations will gather around you like the way predators gather around their prey. And Sahaba said, is it because we are weak or we are low in numbers, Ya Rasulullah? He says, no, but it is because of wahan that Allah casts into your heart, weakness. And they said, what is this weakness? What is this wahan that's going to be cast into our hearts? He says, love of the dunya and the hatred of death, meaning the hatred of sacrificing for the sake of Allah. We're too attached to material that we can't sacrifice. Everybody's ego and self-interest is what's driving them. And so he said, because you love the dunya so much and nobody wants to make that sacrifice, and the greatest sacrifice is to die in the way of Allah, people don't want to make that sacrifice. And so the enemies will see you as a weak nation that can be overtaken and colonized and dominated. And so the Prophet ﷺ foretold that these are illnesses that will come. The scholar has to also be aware of what are the illnesses that is affecting the ummah in their contemporary time. And the final hadith in this section that I want to read. Thawban narrated, the messengers of Allah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, the one we just shared, subhanAllah, I jumped ahead. The nations would vie with each other in attacking you as the eaters vie with each other in attending a banquet. It was said, O Messenger of Allah, will we be few at that time? He said, no, you will be too many, but you will be like the foam of the flood, right? Like the foam of the sea. At that time, Allah will take away fear from your enemies' hearts, and He will cast weakness in your hearts. Al-Wahan. A man said, what is meant by weakness? Al-Wahan. He said, love of life and the hatred of death. Collected by Abu Dawood. It is a Hasan hadith. Thus, you see, this is the author's commentary, you see that our age is the age when humility has decreased, while the love of life and the hatred of death have immensely increased. Based on this, the scholar who does not succeed in curing such vices and perversity has little chance of success in reviving Islam. The knowledgeable preacher has to hold sessions for preaching, education, and purifying the soul. He is entitled to merge them together. It is recommended that he allocate a public session for preaching and special sessions in which he teaches the right ways of remembrance, individually or collectively, where the most suitable portions of the Noble Quran and other knowledge are studied. Alhamdulillah, I feel like, with our ummah, at least in the contemporary world, I feel there's a lot of intellectual knowledge out there, but you don't see very few courses or lectures or programs that focus on spiritual development. Right? If we just think about, we all grew up, majority of us grew up as Muslims, and we've been to masajid and different programs. how many programs actually focus on cultivating the heart and addressing the vices of the heart and remedies and creating exercises, programs, meditations, whatever it be, right? Islamic meditations, of course, in purifying the hearts, in softening the hearts and connecting the people with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? We don't really see too much of that. And this is actually one of the problems of our time. We overemphasize information and we don't emphasize enough the state of the heart and the treatment of the heart. And this is a problem not just on a Western issue, global Muslim issue. Even in Muslim societies, there's a great emphasis on information, halal and haram, but there isn't much programs and awareness and about spiritual and development, right? And so he's saying the scholar has to be one that does that. And there are scholars who do that. I know tasawwuf, and Sufi practices are something that people have different perspectives on. There are those who are, no, that's a red zone, off limits. And there are those who passionately pursue it. And so maybe I will comment on that briefly afterwards, inshallah. Maybe I can end here, inshallah. Let's end here. And I'll just comment on Sufism and what is Sufism a little bit, and why, what our approach should be to this knowledge and this science and to Sufi scholars. Sufism is started on the foundation of purifying the soul. Fiqh studies the laws of Sharia. Aqeedah studies the beliefs of Islam, right? Usul studies the principles of laws, and so on and so forth. What knowledge is there that studies the science, the psychology of purifying the heart? It's Sufism. That is the traditional knowledge of this ummah. It's a science that has been developed to study how do you connect with Allah. Literally, that is the objective of this science.
Is that a part of a meditation too?
Yeah. Sufism has meditation practices, dhikr practices. There's a whole program. Categories, science, there's teachers, there's masters, there's leaders in that field, there's schools, tariqas, they have it's a whole field. It's a vast, just like fiqh, there's Malik, Shafi'i, Ahmed, and Aqeedah, there's different schools. And so Sufism is a science. It's a vast science with an old tradition. Right? And so this science was developed for the purification of the soul. They called it what? Sufism. Tasawwuf. They called it tasawwuf. Now, because spirituality can become oftentimes very mystical and become experiential, extremism is very easy to fall within it. I'm enlightened. Right? What does that mean? How do you define that? Abuse. Right? All people using, this person is a wali of God, and they're using that name to take advantage of communities and exploit them. All sorts of abuse, even physical and sometimes sexual abuse has occurred. Extremism. Right? They're like, I want to be enlightened, and so they start doing things that are contrary to the deen. False beliefs have occurred. And so with Sufism, a lot of deviation has occurred. And because of that, a lot of the ummah has adopted this kind of my God, this is extreme, this cannot be part of Islam. We don't want it at all. Throw it all out. Sufis are all bad, they're all deviants. And other people don't know, these are the people of God. What are you talking about? If you hate these people, who would you love? Because they're people devoted to the worship. The science focuses on developing the heart, having a sheikh, having a wird. There's a program, you have a sheikh that you follow, that becomes your mentor, literally. He gives you azkar that he gives you a wird, right? And there's different terms for in different languages. And he gives you a regimen to follow, and this and that, and there's this program. There's a tariqah, there's a qadiriyah, the shadiliyah, the alawiyah. There's different tariqahs that people have. There's states and maqam and hal. There's stations and conditions that you attain, and there's degrees. It's a whole science. It's really beautiful. But a lot of innovation and a lot of extremism has entered this science. What should be our approach as Muslims? Intellectually fair. It shouldn't be that we accept it as a whole and we like, oh, it's all good. And we shouldn't say that it's all bad. No, there's a lot of good in it. If not the majority of it is good. There's some deviation that needs to be corrected. And so that should be our approach. We should have a nuanced approach, right? And so this science of Sufism and Sufi scholars, if they are following according to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu and they're sound, then it is fair to take from them, and rather actually we need to, because they've developed the science of spiritual development more than any other scholar has. So what they've contributed in spiritual development in Islamic psychology, no one can match that. So to kind of throw that all out and say we don't want nothing to do with it is actually to deprive ourselves from a treasure of knowledge. Does that make sense? Right? And so that is the science of purifying the soul. The reason a lot of scholars stay away from that term is because of the negative connotations that it has. So they go back to the Quranic terminology. What is the Quranic terminology? Purifying the soul. Tazkiyatun nafs. Does that make sense? So that is, a lot of scholars are like, we don't want to use that term just because of, it's a loaded term. There's a lot that comes up with it when you use that term. So they decide to stick with the Islamic or the Quranic term, which is purifying the soul. And so that is something important to consider when exploring or wanting to study the science of purifying the soul. And the specialists in this science are Sufi scholars. Really, they are. Right? So we don't reject them or look down upon them or anything of that sort. They're specialists in their field. But we are, if there's things we feel that maybe might not be sound or accurate, then we can reject those. And we don't have to take everything that is being told to us. So that is my position, at least, when it comes to this science of tasawwuf and Sufism, that it isn't all bad, it isn't also all right. The most of it is good and based on Quran and Sunnah, but there's some deviation in it, and we must be careful with regards to those deviations. That is the end of our lesson tonight. I think I saw a hand here.
I did have a question, but I think somebody else.
I know, Karana, you also had a common question earlier. Yeah. So I'll take yours, and then I'll go here, and then also Sister Layla, inshallah.
See, how you purify the media.
Yeah.
Like example, one of the men, he killed people, right? He tried to ban or the attraction of the
Yeah, the terrorist attack in New Orleans.
And they say in the name of Islam.
Yes.
And this one, things second for the youth too, and the teenager,
Okay.
That they weak iman,
Right.
How do you comment on that?
All right. So the brother asked, right, recently there was an attack by a man who claims to be Muslim, who the news say is a terrorist attack. There's some suspicion around the whole thing and the timing of it and all of that, but face value, right, a terrorist attack by a man who's Muslim, who claims Islam, who killed, I forget, I don't know the number now. I think originally it was like 30 people injured and like 10 people killed. I'm pretty sure the numbers are higher now. And so he's asking, like, when people see, Muslims who don't have knowledge, who aren't connected to the Muslim community, and they see this, they're like, man, this deen is really extreme. What's wrong with this religion, right? There's always some terrorist attack being associated to Islam and something extreme always being associated to Islam. And this is just one example. I mean, there's so many different, issues we can talk about. And so how do we, combat that? We combat that by education. When there's bias and ignorance, you have to have education. Right? And so we have to educate our community and we have to provide them authentic knowledge and teach them, hey, that's not what Islam says. This is what Islam says. Right? And if somebody has a false understanding or an extreme understanding, educate yourself so you understand, like, where did that person make a mistake, right? Another big thing that once I was having a conversation with a brother is like modern issue. In Afghanistan, they passed a law where, like, laws right now where, like, they shut down medical schools for women, and women cannot go to medical school. And I'm like, that is contrary to Islam. It's actually a communal obligation to have female doctors. It is a sin on the ummah if we don't have enough female doctors trained to serve the women population. And so Islamically, it doesn't make sense. But there's a state that says, based on Islam, they're passing this law. right? So we have to educate, right? Because sometimes there are people like that and there are people like this. And so the way you overcome these contradicting, problematic things is educate yourself so that you know, like, hey, I receive my knowledge not from CNN and, you know, Fox News and whatever else. I receive my knowledge from scholars, from credible sources. And that is what I base my understanding of Islam on. Now, what's going on over there? I don't know. I don't know why they passed that. I can't judge them. I'm not judging them, but I can speak about my faith and I can speak about my deen, right? So I can't speak on their situation because that's a whole other country. Who knows the circumstances, the culture, the politics? I don't know what they're dealing with, but that, based on Islam, is contradicting the values and teachings of Islam. Rather, it is sinful when we look at the basis of deen to prevent the community from having trained medical doctors for men and women and children is a sin. Is a sin. So why they're doing that, I don't know, but this is what Islam says. So education. Education is the way to combat ignorance and misunderstandings. Wallahu alam. Sister Nancy.
I was just going to ask about hadiths because from what you said tonight and from what I've heard otherwise, something really unique about Islam is that the hadiths have kind of a genealogy.
Yes.
Where it comes from. On the other hand, they're not all the same. They also do have really different opinions from each other.
Yes.
So I wondered how we reconcile.
Yes. So the question is regarding the different degrees of hadith as well as the variations that exist within one hadith. Right? There's a hadith, but sometimes there's an opposite meaning carried by another hadith. So how do we kind of reconcile that? There are many ways to reconcile that. Scholars have different principles. But first thing we have to do is we have to determine the authenticity of the text, number one. And then once we determine the authenticity of the text, we see, is there a way to reconcile the meaning of this hadith versus the meaning of another hadith, right? I want to think of an example that maybe might clarify this. Nothing's coming to mind right now. If somebody has a mind, like a general text and a specific text. I'm thinking al-am wal-khas. For example, let's say Fatiha. For example, let's say Fatiha. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that's authentic in Sahih Muslim, it says there's no salah without Fatiha. There's no salah without Fatiha. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْ. Read whatever is easy for you to recite from the Quran. Our scholars said, how do we reconcile between these two? The Quran is saying, read whatever is easy for you to recite, and this hadith says, there's no salah without Fatiha. So scholars took two different interpretations, right? And they kind of they try to reconcile. So there's one group adopts one approach, and this other group adopts a different approach. So the Hanafi position adopted that Fatiha is not obligatory. When the Prophet ﷺ said, there's no salah without Fatiha, they mean there's no complete salah without Fatiha, but it does not mean there's no valid salah without Fatiha. Do you see how they kind of look? What does it mean when you say there's no, is it complete or is it perfect or does it mean validity? So the Hanafi said, we're going to act on the ayah which says, read some portion of the Quran. So they say 3 verses, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is sufficient. You don't have to recite the whole Fatiha in the Hanafi school. And the Shafi'i school said, no, the hadith means there's no valid salah. It's referring to validity. And they said that the ayah is abrogated because that was in the beginning of Islam, but later on Fatiha became an obligation, for example, right? So the scholars adopt this like very kind of critical process, and there are many principles on how do we reconcile between texts. And so they look at the meanings, they look at this, and they look at the other. Now let's say there's no reconciliation possible. Then they come to a conclusion that which one has a greater number of narrators, right? So there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, when he made tashahhud, the majority of them, he never moved his finger. In one hadith, it said the Prophet ﷺ, when he made tashahhud, he moved his finger. And so the majority of scholars said, don't move your finger, because the predominant majority of the hadith never described the Prophet ﷺ moving his finger in tashahhud. And they said movement also contradicts the nature of salah. So it's probably that this hadith that says moving the finger, although the hadith is authentic, there has to be some flaw in that hadith, either by the narrator or some of the one of the narrators or something was mistaken. Although the hadith is still authentic, they take that position. So there are many, many rules, and so once a person studies like the sciences of Sharia, and they study the language and the usul, they start to learn how do we reconcile about texts that might appear contradicting. But that requires, I think, a more scholarly level of studying. But if a person has a question, then I would say seek it. Last week on Jum'ah, a brother reached out to me, and he was asking me about the people of Jannah. He said the Quran keeps describing women of Jannah being, modest and not, mixing with men. And so he said, does that mean like the women of Jannah will not be able to be with their loved ones, and will there be like this hijab in Jannah? He said, how do we reconcile this? Right? So we had a very detailed discussion, and we were talking about the ayat, and no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says that the people of Jannah will be with all their loved ones and with their brothers, and there will be no sense of jealousy, and so I'm like, that is what we know. Now, how do we explain this? We can explain this in many ways. One is just referring to the quality of modesty, that people will be modest. There will be no worry of relationships being violated. Right? People's unions will be sacred between spouses to the point that they're protected, and anything that would in any way violate that union between a man and his wife would be protected. They would be protected from that in Jannah. Right? So we have to contextualize what this man was understanding from the hadith, right? And so whenever with hadith and text, we have to kind of study and figure out like how do we reconcile, and that just requires a more in-depth scholarly level of analysis to reconcile between information. And my advice is if you ever have a question and you feel like there's a contradiction, then seek a scholar who you can engage and ask your questions to. I'll close with your question and then yours, and then we'll wrap up, inshallah. Layla.
Yes. Okay, mine is more on tasawwuf and I guess spiritual action with Muslims.
Right.
I know a lot of times it's been very, very stigmatized.
Right.
And like you said, we don't know much of the spirituality of it because we're told stay away as much as you can.
Right.
But I'm wondering, why is the emphasis more on that versus the extreme side of the actionable Muslims? Like, it's easier for us to accommodate to the extreme of, like, I don't know if there is even an extreme, I guess I could say that, versus the extreme deviation that's happening within the Sufi community.
Right. So if I'm understanding your question is, why is there a greater emphasis on like abstaining from tasawwuf, right? Why is there this negative reputation that scholars and learned people like just preach, right? It isn't just a rumor. Like it's people passionately warn the community about staying away from tasawwuf and anything that has to do with the Sufi tradition, right? Extremism begets extremism. I think tasawwuf deviated, and not that tasawwuf deviated, but a lot of people that practice Sufism deviated. And when many of the ummah saw that, even learned folks, they took the extreme, which is what? This thing is all bad, stay away. Because that's just natural human being. When you have one extreme, we go to the complete what? Other opposite extreme, right? And so that's where the ummah went. Even learned people, they went to the other extreme where they're like, this is all bad, it's innovative, it's deviant, stay away, it's bad, they're innovators, they're, Ahl al-Nar, this and that. I mean, it's really like extreme. But if you were to critically analyze tasawwuf and Sufism, and you were to be fair and not biased by some of the extremism that is out there, you would find that tasawwuf is based on Quran and Sunnah. It is a valid science, and that there is deviation within it, and sometimes some serious deviation by some prominent people in that practice, but it doesn't discredit the credibility of the entire science. So to answer your question, why has this become so prominent, this negative, this I don't know, not bias, sorry, use the word, but stigma, right? I think it's because the extremism that existed and a lot of deviation that occurred, then this stigma became very widespread.
I guess a quick follow-up to that one as well did the deviation occur because it has to do with the soul, that it's easier to move away, or like how?
Where did the deviation occur? I think it occurred to the boundaries that were set on where people can kind of have the flexibility to create their own practices, right? Some people created dancing, some people added musical instruments, the poetry, like people kept adding things. And also misunderstandings of Sharia. A lot of people just kind of abandoned Sharia or became very flexible with Sharia. And they're like, no, as long as we focus on the hearts, everything is fine. So I think there was an imbalance between Sharia and spirituality. And so proper tasawwuf balances Sharia with spirituality. Because if you just go spiritual without no law, then you're just going to be a mystic in some cave and just worshiping God and achieving this enlightenment, but you have no law to guide you. And so Islam is a balance of the two, right? And the Prophet ﷺ is that balance. So the Prophet ﷺ he was a monk. The Sahaba were described as monks during night, warriors during the day, right? That was the approach that the Ummah had. And so returning to that practical kind of balance between Sharia and spirituality. Now the other extremism we have today is the other side. We've become so hyper-technical about halal and haram and the do's and the don'ts that is like, you don't even experience the sweetness of Islam anymore. So now we have another serious problem, and this is as dangerous as the other one, right? That Islam has become this technical thing, like it's do's and don'ts and, formalities, and it's like, you're just going with the motions, right? And so we have to come and bring that back. And sound scholars, they're able to bridge that gap, right? They bring the law with their spirituality. They bring the mannerism and the etiquettes and the character with the prohibitions and the obligations. And they balance the two, right? It isn't just, God, only God can judge me. Yes, only God can judge you, but he judges you based on this law, right? Balancing the two, right? So that is what we have to kind of bring back, right? Not fall into this extremism or the other. Brother Abdurrahman, your comment or question, and then we'll conclude. Yes, that's very sound. So the brother was saying, I think the conclusion of it was when it comes to like hadith and understanding hadith and the meanings and maybe apparent contradictions, he said that our scholars advise that we should study fiqh first because we are not trained enough to start studying hadith independently on our own, right? So that's very sound, and I do encourage that we don't make any conclusion about the deen just because we read a hadith and we're like, well, this is what Islam says. No, you have to look at the scholarly understanding. What do the scholars explain about this hadith? And from there, you build your understanding. But one of the extremisms that has created is that the books of hadith were kind of like not studied. They were kind of like, oh, no, you don't read hadith at all. Right? You're just like, you don't do that. That's only for the scholars. And that's also not true. Because hadith is for everybody to read, the words of the Prophet ﷺ, right? So I think a healthy balance, like read hadith, but don't make interpretations. Read tafsir, but don't think yourself, oh, I read, mashallah, a 3-volume book on tafsir of Quran. I can tell you what the Quran means, and here, let me teach you a lesson on tafsir of Quran. No, because to do that, you need to be trained, right? Just like one wanted to study medicine. You did a research, you try to understand some disease, illness, right? You have a good understanding. But you're not going to try to diagnose or treat anybody, right? That would be a crime, right? Like that would be you'd be sued for that, right? And same thing with Islam. Like you learn the deen, read the hadith, read the Quran, read the tafsir. You don't need a scholar to do that. Any Muslim can read. But don't assume yourself to be a trained scholar to start teaching and preaching and lecturing on what this and the other means because you are intelligent and you think you've gained a deeper understanding that others have not attained. And I've seen that. I've seen a brother send me a video recently, and I'll close with this, and it was just disturbing. He's like, listen to this guy. He claims he has this new understanding of Quran, and the scholars were mistaken. I listened, and I'm like, oh my God. After like 20 minutes, I'm like, there's so many gaps in his thinking that if a person who trained with scholars and trained, had proper education, would know that this man's understanding is flawed. But he thinks he's achieved some new understanding about Islam that nobody knew before, because he was never properly trained. And so that's the type of understanding. So if you ever find these, they're highly intelligent, capable people, but they claim they have some new understanding about the deen and Muslims were wrong and this or the other, or that person is probably is somebody very intelligent who's read a lot but has never actually received proper training. I'll conclude with that. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our knowledge, to benefit us by what He has taught us. We ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to purify our hearts. We ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us sincerity, to make His love, His remembrance, and His worship easy for us. We ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us steadfast on His deen, to make us among the believers who are guided by La ilaha illallah in all their affairs. We ask Allah to forgive us, our parents, our teachers, and all of the believing men and women, and to ease the affairs of those who are afflicted in Gaza, in Sudan, in China, in every part of the world, to have mercy on us and the entire ummah. Allahumma ameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.